A white priest walked into Montgomery, Alabama in the spring of 1962. He walked out without his shoes. What happened in between would cost him everything, his reputation, his health, his life. But it would also ignite a movement that no one saw coming. This is the story they never told you. The story of a man who heard 11 words and couldn't unhear them. The story of 500 miles walked on bleeding feet. The story of Martin Luther King Jr. kneeling before a dying stranger and washing his wounds with his own hands. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's start at the beginning. The night everything changed. Montgomery, Alabama, March 1962. The Dexter Avenue Baptist Church was packed beyond capacity. Bodies pressed against bodies, sweat mingling with the heavy Alabama air that seemed to carry the weight of 2 centuries of oppression. Outside, a crowd of 300 more strained to hear through open windows, their faces illuminated by street lamps that flickered like dying stars. The church itself was modest by northern standards. Red brick, white columns, a steeple that pointed toward a heaven that sometimes felt impossibly far away. But within these walls, history had been made before. It was here that the Montgomery bus boycott had been organized 7 years earlier. Here that a young preacher had first raised his voice against injustice. Here that a movement had been born. And here, on this humid March evening, that movement was about to claim another soul. Inside, seated in the 5th row, was Father Thomas McCarthy, 43 years old, Irish Catholic, pastor of St. Augustine's Parish in Richmond, Virginia, a comfortable congregation of comfortable people who preferred their sermons short and their coffee hot. He had come to Montgomery on a whim, or so he told himself. A colleague had mentioned the young Baptist preacher who was stirring up trouble in the South. McCarthy wanted to see what all the fuss was about. He told himself it was curiosity. Professional interest, the detached observation of a scholar examining a specimen. He did not tell himself the truth. That something was missing from his faith, from his life, from the comfortable sermons he delivered to comfortable people in their comfortable pews. He did not admit that he had come to Montgomery because he was spiritually starving and had heard there was bread here. He expected a shouting match, a political rally dressed in religious clothing. He expected to leave after 20 minutes, confirmed in his belief that moderation was the only sensible path, that change must come gradually, that patience was the highest virtue. He did not expect Martin Luther King Jr. King walked to the pulpit slowly, deliberately, each step measured like a heartbeat. He was younger than McCarthy had imagined, only 33, the age of Christ at Calvary, but he moved with the gravity of a man who had already seen too much, carried too much, sacrificed too much. His suit was simple, dark, slightly rumpled from the journey. His face showed the exhaustion of 1,000 battles, but his eyes, those eyes burned with something that made McCarthy shift uncomfortably in his seat. Those eyes swept across the congregation like searchlights, and for a moment they seemed to pause on McCarthy. On his white face in a sea of black faces, on his Roman collar gleaming like a beacon of institutional comfort, on his polished shoes reflecting the candlelight, $40 worth of leather and privilege. King began to speak. His voice was low at first, almost conversational, like a father speaking to children gathered at his knee. He spoke of justice, of dignity, of the long arc of history bending toward righteousness. McCarthy found himself leaning forward, drawn in despite himself, his professional detachment crumbling like a sandcastle against the tide. The words were familiar. He had read them in newspapers, heard them discussed in faculty lounges, debated them with colleagues over whiskey and cigars. But hearing them spoken was something else entirely. It was like the difference between reading about fire and feeling its heat. Like the difference between studying the ocean and drowning in it. King spoke of children bitten by police dogs in Birmingham, of women knocked down by fire hoses so powerful they tore the clothes from their bodies, of men beaten with clubs while praying on courthouse steps. He spoke of the 4 little girls who would soon die in a church bombing, though he didn't know that yet, couldn't know that yet, but somehow seemed to sense the coming horror, as if the future was a weight he already carried. He spoke of 400 years. The long middle passage, the auction blocks, The whips and chains, the Jim Crow laws, the separate water fountains and back doors and balcony sections, the constant daily humiliation of being told you are less than human in a nation that claims all men are created equal. And then King's eyes found McCarthy again. "I want to speak tonight to the moderates," King said, his voice rising. "To the good people who agree with our goals but not our methods. To the white ministers and priests and rabbis who send letters of support but never march beside us. To those who counsel patience while our children are bitten by dogs and blasted by fire hoses." McCarthy felt his face flush. It was as if King was reading his mail. "Let me tell you something about silence," King continued, his finger pointing now, sweeping across the room. "Silence is not neutrality. Silence is not peace. Silence is the language of the oppressor. When you see injustice and say nothing, you have spoken. You have said yes to the whip. You have said yes to the noose. You have said yes to every boot on every neck." The church erupted. Amens cascaded like thunder, but McCarthy sat frozen, his hands gripping the pew in front of him. King wasn't finished. "I look out tonight and I see comfortable shoes," he said, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. The congregation leaned in. "I see shoes that have never walked on broken glass. Shoes that have never fled from dogs. Shoes that have never stood in line for 12 hours to cast a vote that will be thrown away." And I ask myself, how can these shoes speak of brotherhood? How can these shoes preach justice? He paused. The silence was absolute. "Your shoes are too comfortable, my friends. While your brothers and sisters walk through fire, you walk on carpet. While they bleed, you polish. And every comfortable step you take is a step away from God." McCarthy looked down at his feet. Black leather Oxfords, freshly shined. They had cost him $40, a month's salary for many of the people in this room. He had been proud of them that morning. Now they felt like chains. The service ended at 10:47 p.m. McCarthy knows the exact time because he checked his watch. He had a train to catch the next morning, a sermon to prepare, a life to return to. The detour was over, time to go back to being reasonable. He pushed through the crowd toward the exit, but at the door a hand touched his shoulder. "Father McCarthy." He turned. King stood before him, smaller than he appeared at the pulpit, his eyes tired but kind. "I noticed you in the congregation," King said. "You came a long way to hear a Baptist preach." "I was curious," McCarthy managed. "I wanted to understand." King nodded slowly. "And do you understand?" McCarthy opened his mouth to answer, but nothing came out. What could he say? That he understood intellectually but couldn't commit emotionally. That he agreed in principle but feared the consequences. That he wanted to help but didn't want to sacrifice. King smiled, not with triumph but with something like compassion. "Understanding is not agreement, Father. Understanding is action. The question is not whether you comprehend our struggle. The question is whether you will join it." And then King said the 11 words that would destroy Thomas McCarthy's comfortable life. "While they suffer in bare feet, can you stand in polished shoes?" King squeezed his shoulder once, then disappeared into the crowd. McCarthy stood in the doorway for a long time. People streamed past him, talking, laughing, crying, alive with purpose. He felt like a ghost among them, present but not participating, visible but not seen. At 11:23 p.m., Father Thomas McCarthy did something he couldn't explain then and couldn't fully explain for the rest of his life. He bent down, unlaced his $40 Oxfords, removed them along with his socks, and placed them neatly on the church steps. Then he started walking. He did not know where he was going. He did not have a plan. He only knew that he could not put those shoes back on. Not after what he had heard. Not after what he had understood. The first mile was easy. The streets of Montgomery were smooth, still warm from the day's sun. McCarthy walked north toward nothing in particular, his mind churning with King's words. The second mile was harder. Gravel. Glass. The detritus of a city that didn't clean its black neighborhoods as well as its white ones. McCarthy felt each pebble, each shard, each broken thing beneath his feet. By the 5th mile, he was bleeding. He didn't stop. The next morning, a farmer named Willie Johnson found McCarthy sitting by the side of Highway 31, his feet wrapped in torn strips of his own shirt, his face pale with exhaustion and something else, something that looked almost like ecstasy. Johnson was 67 years old. He had picked cotton since he was 5. He had watched his father lynched when he was 12. He had buried 2 sons, one killed in Korea, one killed by the Klan. He thought he had seen everything a man could see in this broken world. He had never seen a white man choose to suffer. "Lord have mercy," Johnson said, pulling his truck to the shoulder, the engine coughing and sputtering like an old man's laugh. "What happened to you, father?" McCarthy looked up. His eyes were red from lack of sleep, ringed with dust and dried tears, but they were clear, clearer than they had been in years, perhaps clearer than they had ever been. "I'm walking to Birmingham," he said. His voice was hoarse, cracked from a night of weeping and praying and walking and bleeding, but there was no self-pity in it, no regret, only a strange, quiet joy that made Johnson take a step back. Johnson stared at him. Birmingham was over 90 miles away, 90 miles of Alabama road, gravel and glass, sun and storm, hatred and heat. White men drove that distance in air-conditioned cars and still complained about the journey. "In bare feet?" Johnson asked, the question carrying decades of disbelief. "A man told me something last night," McCarthy said, and as he spoke, his hand moved unconsciously to his chest, as if protecting something precious hidden there. "He told me that while my brothers and sisters suffer, I cannot stand in comfort. So I'm walking. I'm walking until I understand what they feel. I'm walking until my feet know what their feet know. I'm walking until the distance between us disappears." Johnson was quiet for a long moment. Somewhere in the distance, a rooster crowed. Late, confused, like the whole world had tilted on its axis and the rules no longer applied. A car passed on the highway without stopping, the white driver staring straight ahead, pretending not to see the old black farmer and the bloody white priest on the shoulder of the road. Then Johnson reached into his truck and pulled out a canteen of water. It was dented, scratched, the same canteen he had carried in World War I when he had fought for a country that wouldn't let him drink from its water fountains. "I can't give you shoes, father, but I can give you this." McCarthy took the canteen. Their hands touched. Black fingers and white fingers, calloused and bleeding, in this small exchange that meant nothing and everything. "Thank you," McCarthy whispered. "Thank you." "One more thing," Johnson said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small worn Bible, its cover soft as skin from decades of handling, its pages thin as whispers. "My mama gave me this, carried it with her from Mississippi when she was sold to a new master at 14 years old. She walked 200 miles in chains, father, barefoot. She told me the Lord carried her every step, that every time her feet touched the ground she felt his hands beneath her." He pressed the Bible into McCarthy's hands. His eyes were wet, but his voice was steady. "Maybe he'll carry you too." Word spread faster than McCarthy walked. By the 3rd day, reporters had found him. A white priest walking barefoot through Alabama, preaching about justice to anyone who would listen. It was too strange a story to ignore. "Why are you doing this?" they asked, cameras flashing. McCarthy's answer was always the same. "A man asked me a question. I'm still answering it." "What question?" "While they suffer in bare feet, can you stand in polished shoes?" The reporters didn't understand. How could they? They wore shoes. They drove cars. They reported on suffering from a safe distance, then went home to warm dinners and soft beds. But McCarthy had stepped off that safe distance, and he couldn't step back on. In every town he passed through, something happened. People came out of their houses to watch him. At first they just stared. A white man walking barefoot, his feet bloodied and bandaged. It made no sense. Then they started to listen. McCarthy would stop in town squares, his voice hoarse but strong, and he would repeat King's teachings, not as a scholar, not as a theologian, as a man who had finally heard them. "Hatred cannot drive out hatred," he would say. "Only love can do that." I didn't understand those words until I started walking. I thought love was a feeling, but love is a choice. Love is action. Love is walking when your feet are bleeding because your brothers and sisters have walked bleeding for 400 years. Some people spat at him, called him a traitor, a fool, a lover of the wrong people. In Prattville, a group of young white men surrounded him, their faces twisted with rage. "You're a disgrace to your race," their leader snarled, shoving McCarthy backward, walking barefoot like some kind of animal, like one of them. McCarthy stumbled but didn't fall. He looked at the young man, really looked, and saw something behind the hatred, fear, confusion. A boy taught to hate before he was taught to think. "I'm not walking like them," McCarthy said quietly. "I'm walking with them. There's a difference, and I'm walking for you too, whether you know it or not." "For me?" The young man laughed, but it was hollow. "I don't need anything from you." "Yes, you do," McCarthy replied. "You need to be free. Not from them, from the hatred that's eating you alive. I can see it in your eyes. The same hatred that was eating me 3 weeks ago. It's a prison, son, and I'm trying to show you the door." The young man's fist was raised. It stayed raised for a long moment. Then, slowly, it dropped. He stepped back, something shifting in his expression, not understanding, not yet, but the first crack in a wall that had been built since childhood. McCarthy kept walking. He didn't look back. But witnesses said the young man stood there for almost an hour, watching him go, his friends eventually leaving without him. Others wept. In Selma, an elderly black woman named Hattie Mae Johnson, no relation to the farmer who had given McCarthy water, pushed through a crowd to reach him. Her face was lined with decades of sorrow, her hands rough from a lifetime of work in white people's kitchens. She didn't speak. She simply knelt down, took McCarthy's bleeding feet in her hands and kissed them. McCarthy tried to pull away, horrified. "No, please, you shouldn't." "Hush now," Hattie Mae said, her voice steady as bedrock. "I've been waiting 73 years to see a white man suffer for us, instead of making us suffer for him. Let me have this moment." McCarthy stood there, tears streaming down his face, as this woman who had every reason to hate him showed him something he had never truly understood before: the grace of the wounded, the forgiveness of the oppressed, the terrifying generosity of those who have been given nothing and still find something to give. When Hattie Mae finally stood, she pressed something into his hand, a small wooden cross, worn smooth by decades of prayer. "My mama carved this during slavery times," she said. "She told me to give it to someone who deserved it. I've been carrying it for 50 years, waiting. You deserve it now." McCarthy carried that cross for the rest of his journey. He was buried with it, and some, more each day, took off their shoes and joined him. By the second week, McCarthy wasn't walking alone. 12 people had joined him by Selma, 50 by Marion. By the time he crossed into Jefferson County, the crowd behind him numbered over 300, black and white, young and old, Protestant and Catholic, believers and doubters united by bleeding feet and burning conviction. Among them was a young Jewish rabbi named David Weinstein from Chicago. He had read about McCarthy in the Tribune and taken a train south without telling his congregation. When asked why, he simply said, "My people wandered the desert for 40 years. The least I can do is walk 40 miles. There was also Margaret Chen, a Chinese-American schoolteacher from San Francisco whose parents had been interned during World War II. "I know what it means to be imprisoned for how you look," she told a reporter. "If this priest can walk through hell for people who don't look like him, I can walk beside him." And there was Samuel Rivers, a decorated black veteran of the Korean War who had earned 3 Purple Hearts fighting for a country that wouldn't serve him at a lunch counter. He walked at the front of the column, his medals pinned to his chest, his feet bare, his head held high. "I bled for America overseas," Rivers said when reporters asked why he marched. "Now I'm bleeding for America at home. The difference is, this time I know exactly what I'm fighting for." The Barefoot Army grew with each passing mile. They came from everywhere, from cities and farms, from churches and universities, from lives of comfort and lives of struggle. They came because McCarthy's walk had shown them something they couldn't unsee, that solidarity isn't a word, it's a wound. That brotherhood isn't a concept, it's a choice. That love, real love, draws blood. News of the Barefoot March reached King in Atlanta. His advisors were skeptical. "It's a distraction," one said, "a spectacle. This McCarthy is making us look like fanatics." But King shook his head. "No," he said softly, "he's making us look human. He's showing them what conversion looks like. Not a change of mind, a change of feet." King made a decision. He would meet McCarthy in Birmingham. He would be there when the barefoot priest arrived. What he didn't know, what no one knew, was that McCarthy might not survive the journey. Day 19, 40 miles from Birmingham. The end was near, in more ways than one. McCarthy collapsed on the road outside Bessemer, his body finally surrendering to what his spirit refused to acknowledge. He fell like a tree cut at the root, slowly at first, then all at once, his face striking the gravel with a sound that made everyone around him cry out in horror. His feet were no longer recognizable as feet. They were wounds, open, weeping, infected. The flesh had torn away in places, revealing muscle and bone. The infection had crept upward like a dark tide, turning his ankles black, his calves mottled with the purple red of spreading poison. The smell was something no one who witnessed it would ever forget. A local doctor named Henry Crawford, a white man who had never treated a black patient, who had signed petitions against integration, who had voted for segregationists his entire life, pushed through the crowd. He had come to observe, perhaps to mock. He left transformed. Crawford examined McCarthy's feet with hands that trembled despite 30 years of practice. He had seen gangrene in the war. He had seen infections take limbs and lives, but he had never seen someone choose this. Never seen someone walk into suffering with open eyes and keep walking even as the suffering consumed them. His diagnosis was delivered plainly, clinically, but his voice cracked on the final word. If you keep walking, you'll die. The infection has entered your bloodstream. It will reach your heart within a week, maybe less. The only chance you have is immediate hospitalization, aggressive treatment, possible amputation. If you walk another mile, I cannot save you. No one can. The crowd fell silent. 300 people held their breath, waiting for McCarthy to accept the obvious, to choose life, to say that he had made his point, and now it was time to let others carry the burden. McCarthy listened to every word. He looked at his ruined feet, really looked, as if seeing them for the first time. Then he looked up at the sky, pale blue and infinite, and smiled. He stood up. The crowd gasped. Someone shouted, "No." A woman began to weep. "Then I'll die walking," McCarthy said, his voice somehow stronger than it had been in days, as if the proximity of death had burned away everything unnecessary and left only the essential truth. "Better to die on my feet than live on my knees. A man named King taught me that. And I believe it now more than I've ever believed anything in my life." He paused, swaying slightly, his eyes finding faces in the crowd. Black and white, young and old, believers and skeptics, all of them watching him with something between horror and awe. "I've spent my whole life being safe," McCarthy continued. "Safe in my church. Safe in my beliefs. Safe in my distance from other people's suffering. And you know what that safety bought me? Nothing. A comfortable life and an empty soul. But these past 19 days, these bleeding, agonizing, beautiful days, I have felt more alive than in all my 43 years combined. I have felt God in every step. I have felt love in every wound. I will not trade that for more years of comfortable emptiness. I cannot." Dr. Crawford stared at him. For a long moment, no one moved. Then the doctor did something that shocked everyone present, most of all himself. He took off his shoes. "I've spent my whole life healing bodies," Crawford said quietly, his voice breaking. "But I've never healed a soul, maybe not even my own." He kicked his expensive leather loafers aside, peeled off his socks and stood barefoot on the Alabama gravel. "I'll walk with you, and if you fall, I'll carry you, and if you die, I'll carry your body to Birmingham myself, because whatever you have, whatever this is, I want it. God help me, I want it." By the time they reached the Birmingham city limits, 2,000 people walked behind them. The crowd stretched back for miles, a river of bare feet flowing toward the city that had become synonymous with hatred, with fire hoses and police dogs and bombs in churches, a river of souls walking toward redemption. And at the front of that river, waiting with tears streaming down his face, stood Martin Luther King Jr., Birmingham. April 7th, 1962, 3:47 p.m. King saw him coming from a distance, a stumbling figure, supported on either side by strangers who had become family over 500 miles of shared suffering. McCarthy's face was gaunt, his eyes sunken, his body failing. But his feet, those ruined, bleeding, beautiful feet, kept moving. The crowd parted as King walked forward. Silence fell like a curtain. 2,000 people held their breath. McCarthy stopped 3 feet from King. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Then McCarthy's legs gave out. King caught him before he hit the ground. Gently, carefully, he lowered the priest to the dusty Birmingham street. McCarthy's eyes fluttered open, focusing on King's face above him. "I walked," McCarthy whispered. "I finally walked." King nodded, his eyes glistening. "I know, brother. I know you did." And then Martin Luther King Jr. did something that would become the most iconic image of the civil rights movement, more powerful than any speech, more enduring than any march. He called for water. A basin was brought. King knelt in the dirt, took McCarthy's destroyed feet in his hands and began to wash them. The crowd gasped. A black man washing a white man's feet. The symbolism was unmistakable and devastating. Jesus had washed the feet of his disciples. Now King was washing the feet of a man who had walked through fire to join him. McCarthy tried to pull away. "No," he said, his voice breaking. "I should be washing yours, after everything, after 400 years. King silenced him with a look. "Brother," King said, his hands gentle on McCarthy's wounds, "you walked 500 miles. I'm just carrying a little water. But let me tell you what these feet mean to me." He looked up at the crowd. 2,000 faces, black and white, united. "These feet," King said, his voice carrying across the silent street, "are not the feet of a white man. They are not the feet of a Catholic. They are not the feet of an outsider. These are the feet of freedom. These are the feet that chose to suffer when they could have remained comfortable. These are the feet that answered the question I asked 3 weeks ago." He paused, his hands still cradling McCarthy's feet. "I asked Father McCarthy, while they suffer in bare feet, can you stand in polished shoes?" And he answered, not with words, not with promises, not with donations or letters or prayers from a distance. He answered with 500 miles of blood and blisters and belief. King stood, still holding McCarthy's hand. "This is what conversion looks like. This is what brotherhood means. Not agreement, sacrifice. Not sympathy, solidarity. Not watching from the sidelines, walking into the fire." The crowd erupted. Applause, tears, voices raised in hymns that rose above Birmingham like prayers. Someone started singing "We Shall Overcome," and within seconds 2,000 voices joined in. A chorus of the wounded, the hopeful, the transformed. King helped McCarthy to his feet, supporting him with an arm around his waist. They stood together, the black preacher and the white priest, the leader and the follower who had become a leader himself, and looked out at what they had created. McCarthy spoke then, his voice barely above a whisper, but somehow audible to everyone. "3 weeks ago I was a moderate," he said. "I believed in justice, but I believed in patience more. I agreed with the cause, but I disagreed with the methods. I prayed for change, but I prayed from a comfortable distance." He paused, swaying slightly. King steadied him. "Then a man asked me a question, a simple question, and I realized that all my prayers, all my beliefs, all my good intentions meant nothing if my feet stayed planted in comfort while my brothers and sisters walked through fire." He looked at King, his eyes filled with gratitude and exhaustion and something that might have been peace. "You asked me if I could stand in polished shoes while they suffered in bare feet. The answer is no. I cannot. I will not. And I pray that everyone who hears this story asks themselves the same question. Because the answer, the real answer, requires more than words. It requires walking. It requires bleeding. It requires becoming uncomfortable so that others might find comfort." King embraced him then, a long embrace, witnessed by thousands, photographed by dozens, remembered by millions. Two men from different worlds, different faiths, different histories, holding each other in the middle of a Birmingham street while a revolution bloomed around them. And in that moment, something shifted in America. Not everywhere, not for everyone, but for the 2,000 people who witnessed it, and for the millions who would see the photograph in the next day's newspapers. The civil rights movement was no longer just about black Americans fighting for their rights. It was about all Americans choosing who they wanted to be. Father Thomas McCarthy died 3 weeks later. The infection had spread too far. The doctors did everything they could, but some journeys take you places from which you cannot return. McCarthy knew this. He had known it since Bessemer. He had chosen to keep walking anyway. Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his eulogy. The church, St. Paul's Cathedral in Birmingham, was filled beyond capacity. 5,000 people crammed inside. 10,000 more stood outside, barefoot despite the April rain. King stood at the pulpit, his voice heavy with grief but steady with purpose. Thomas McCarthy walked 500 miles, King began, but the journey he made was much longer than that. He walked from comfort to courage, from silence to solidarity, from the pews of the passive to the front lines of freedom. He paused, looking out at the sea of faces, black and white together. Some of you knew Thomas before his walk. You knew him as a moderate, a reasonable man, a man who agreed with justice in principle but counselled patience in practice, and I want to tell you something about that man. King's voice dropped, intimate despite the thousands listening. That man is not who we bury today. That man died on a church step in Montgomery 3 weeks ago when he took off his shoes. The man we bury today is someone different. Someone transformed. Someone who discovered that faith is not what you believe, it's what you're willing to bleed for. King stepped back from the pulpit. He reached down and removed his own shoes, then his socks. He stood before 5,000 people, barefoot, as he had never stood before. Thomas McCarthy's feet are silent now, King said, but the footsteps he left behind will echo forever. Every time someone chooses discomfort over complicity, every time someone walks toward injustice instead of away from it, every time someone takes off their comfortable shoes and says, "I will suffer with those who suffer," Thomas McCarthy walks again. He looked out at the congregation. So I ask you now, as I asked him 3 weeks ago, while your brother-sisters walk through fire, can you stand on the sidelines? While they bleed for freedom, can you remain comfortable? While they march toward justice, can you stay seated? The congregation stirred, and then one by one they began to remove their shoes. First a few, then dozens, then hundreds. The sound of shoes dropping filled the cathedral, leather on marble, rubber on wood, the rhythm of a revolution beginning. By the time King spoke his final words, 5,000 people stood barefoot in Birmingham's grandest church, their shoes abandoned like chains they no longer needed. Thomas McCarthy's feet are buried today, King said, his voice rising to fill every corner of that sacred space. But look around you. Look at what he has done. His feet have multiplied. His walk continues, and it will not stop. Not until every person in this nation can walk freely, without fear, without hatred, without the weight of 400 years pressing down on every step. He raised his hand in benediction. Walk on, Thomas. Walk on. We'll follow. The tradition continues to this day. Every year on April 7th, thousands of people around the world participate in the McCarthy Walk, a barefoot march to honour those who suffered for justice. In Birmingham, the walk follows the same path that Thomas McCarthy stumbled down in 1962, ending at the spot where Martin Luther King Jr. washed his feet. The walk has spread far beyond Alabama. In London, marchers walk barefoot from Trafalgar Square to Westminster. In Tokyo, they circle the Imperial Palace. In Cape Town, they walk the same streets where Nelson Mandela was once forbidden to tread. In cities across 6 continents, on every April 7th, feet touch pavement without protection. A global communion of discomfort, a worldwide declaration that comfort is not the highest value. A statue stands there now, not of McCarthy, not of King, but of a pair of worn, bloody feet, cast in bronze, forever walking towards something just beyond the horizon. The sculpture was created by an artist named Jerome Williams, the grandson of Hattie Mae Johnson, the elderly woman who had kissed McCarthy's feet in Selma. Williams said he designed it to be incomplete, to suggest movement rather than arrival. The journey isn't over, Williams explained at the statue's dedication in 1995. That's the point. McCarthy didn't walk so we could stop walking. He walked so we would know that walking is possible. The plaque beneath it reads, "While they suffer in bare feet, can you stand in polished shoes?" Martin Luther King Jr. to Thomas McCarthy, 1962. Visitors leave their shoes at the base of the statue. Some leave them for hours, some leave them forever. The pile grows every year. Thousands of shoes from every nation, every faith, every walk of life. Running shoes from marathon runners. High heels from executives. Work boots from construction workers. Tiny sneakers from children who don't fully understand why they're there, but somehow understand completely. The city of Birmingham has to clear the shoes periodically. They donate them to homeless shelters, to refugees, to anyone who needs them. It's become part of the tradition, shoes left in sacrifice, given to those in need. McCarthy would have approved. And every year as the sun sets on April 7th, someone walks up barefoot, touches the bronze feet, and whispers the same words. Walk on, Thomas. Walk on. We're still following. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated 6 years after McCarthy's death. In his final speech, the famous mountaintop address, he spoke of promised lands and uncertain futures. But in an earlier draft of that speech, discovered among his papers after his death, there was a passage that didn't make the final version. I have seen many brave things in my life. I have seen men face fire hoses without flinching. I have seen women walk into mobs without fear. I have seen children march toward hatred with love in their hearts. But the bravest thing I ever saw was a white priest taking off his shoes, because he didn't have to. He chose to. And that choice, that impossible, beautiful, world-changing choice, gives me hope that this nation might yet become what it has always claimed to be. The passage was never delivered, but it was found. And now you've found it too. This is Martin Luther King Jr. This is the untold legacy, the stories they never told you, the lessons that matter most.